Welcome to Face to Face. This is a show about change and about what's next. It's a show that wants to ask questions, peel back the layers of our average everyday experience, and go beyond scratching the surface. We interview amazing people with incredible ideas and stories who have done wild, weird, and wonderful things. Remember that imagination shared creates collaboration, and collaboration creates community, and community inspires social change. I'm David Peck, and this is Face to Face. Well, welcome to Face to Face. We are in the middle of it already, and it's not even 10:15 a.m. here in Toronto, and I believe in a part of the States. I'm not really sure where Brian is this morning, but let's get right to it. Our guest, Brian McLaren, with us today. Thanks for joining us, Brian.
Great to be with you as always, David.
Thank you so much for taking the time. You must be pretty busy right now. Are you? I don't know. Are you planning another fishing trip? You writing another book? What's going on over there in your world right now, Brian?
Well, I just finished a book called "We Make the Road by Walking" that will be out in June 10th. So I have, I've been focused on that. I've been traveling a whole lot. And but I just got home at 2:00 this morning, and I've got a couple weeks, and I am for sure going to get out on my little kayak and do a little fly fishing, see if I can catch a tarpon or a snook or two.
A tarpon or a snook? I don't think I know either of those fish. They got to be pretty. They sound like big fish to me.
They're fun. They're a lot of fun, and it'd be like a pike or a muskie in Canada.
Ah, very good. Thank you. Have you done any fishing up here?
A little bit. But I'd love to someday. I love the outdoors, and there's so much of Canada that I'd love to explore someday.
Well, from what I've heard, just even an hour and a half north of Toronto, we got some crazy pike and muskie fishing, and I've certainly never done it. I've caught a few pike over the years, but I've heard crazy things, and I've always had this fantasy of flying in a little Cessna somewhere way up north, into this lake that you can't, and spending a day or two fishing for like the biggest fish you've ever seen,
That's right. Yeah. That's right.
So do our face-to-face podcast listeners get a special deal on We Make the Road by Walking, Brian?
Well, we got to figure that out, David. We'll have to figure that out.
That's right. Have you had any feedback on the new book so far?
Well, it's an unusual book in that you can read it from beginning to end like any other book. But I set it up. It's 52 chapters, which are actually written to be read aloud in about 10 minutes. Wow. So my idea was that a little group of people could say, hey, let's have dinner every Tuesday night and, have some good food and some good wine, and somebody can read a chapter, and then there are discussion questions. And but then a couple of group. I should say, I know some churches are interested in actually using it as their sermon for a year, and then but several little groups like this have already used it, and I got really good feedback from them. It was sort of a field testing before I went public with it.
So why read aloud? Is that the poet in you coming to the surface?
A little bit of that, but also I just think the idea of people getting together to talk about something is really important. I think adults learn more when they're talking than when they're listening. And I think also the really important ideas in life are ideas that in some ways only get texture and shape when they're dialogued about among a circle of friends and family and coworkers and so on. So I just am a big believer that an idea without a community is not nearly as valuable as a community grappling with ideas.
I just finished teaching a course last week at Humber College in Toronto on international development issues and tools, and a very small class. So it's 5 days, 8 hours a day, and 6 students. So that's difficult. I mean, it's a seminar basically you got going on. And I've done this for 5 or 6 years, and I'm not a PowerPoint guy, and I can sort of do the lecture and just continuously chat for 90 minutes at the board, but instead I've really consciously taken the more of the kind of the master class approach with, we don't sit in a circle, but very inclusive and very dialogue driven. And, you always wonder if that's the way to go or not, or gee, are these students really, do they just want the PowerPoint slides? Do they, And so one of the exercises we do, Brian, is we talk about what's development. And so we've got 6 people in this room. 2 of them claim they know nothing about development. One's an accountant and one's in media, but they've got this idea that they want to change the world. Well, isn't that wonderful? Thanks for coming. And okay, so let's, we're an hour in. Let's have this conversation around what development is. And so all of a sudden we start unpacking things like, well, it's about relationships and it's about sustainability and there's the environment and so on. And we spend a good 90 minutes on that. And then I go to the OECD definition of development. And I point to the board and I say, isn't this far better? Isn't this a way richer understanding? And you guys told me 2 hours ago that you knew nothing about development. Yeah. And so I'm drawing it out of their experience and so on. And so I guess I'm just launching off that whole idea of adults learn when they're talking. I think I just have a ton of evidence again for that, just even in the last week. Yeah. And yet, would you agree, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this, our culture isn't set up that way. I mean, it seems to me our schools, my son is 8, my daughter is 6, this is not how they learn. This is not how children are being raised. I don't think. I don't want to sound like an old fart, but maybe I am.
Well, I think we're moving in this direction, but certain institutions are a lot slower to embrace it than others. One of them being public schools, and one of them being churches.
Right.
Even universities. It's surprising how many universities you could find that the professor has a set of notes that he's been using for 15 or 20 years. And he might make small tweaks on them, but it's just figuring out why getting people together to hear the same information that could be presented in 100 different ways. To me, that's there's a huge opportunity cost there, and the same thing happens in churches. But I think in some ways, the more seriously we take the information, if we're looking for a phone number, big deal. But the more seriously we take the information, I think the more important it is that we actually interact about it. And that's where, when you think something like Facebook and social media, I mean, that really is about getting people engaged with each other, for better and for worse. One of the things we see, if you look at comment sections online, is how few people know how to disagree agreeably. How few people know how to do anything other than just go from 0 to 100 on the conflict meter.
The best way to respond on Facebook is to propositionally give somebody the finger, right?
That's right.
Yeah, and to shout and to use exclamation marks and capitals. That's interesting, Brian. Yeah. Why do you think that is? Is it something to do about the art of conversation, or is it that anonymity, or what's your sense?
Yeah. I think all of the above, but I think in some ways the human species is at a different point in evolution, and these are just skills that we didn't need so much anymore. In the old days, when a little tribe of hunter-gatherers lived together, all their interests were very intertwined. There was a clear chief or chieftain who everyone followed, and difference of opinion was probably a threat to survival. And then you get to today's world, where suddenly all those tribes are mashed together. Suddenly we face common threats to our survival, and we have competing interests among our different tribes, and we're mashed together and have to talk. So it's not. I don't think it's that we're being lazy. I think that we're faced with new challenges at a new level, and now is our time. We have to develop these capacities.
Brian, there's something to me that's really, I think anyway, I love the conversation, I love the dialogue. As much as I might not be comfortable with uncertainty, I do love it in a relational setting. Yeah. I think in a book or two ago that you wrote, you talked about when you do talks, you no longer give question and answer or you no longer entertain question and answer sessions, but you talk about question and response sessions. Do you think that the university prof who's, using the same 20-year-old notes, and do you think the pastor and my kid's kindergarten teacher, do you think they're not open to dialogue or open to, conversation because it's kind of risky? And maybe I won't be able to answer my that question. And so your notion of Q&R, this, hey guys, I haven't got it all sorted out either. I write a lot of books, and I I seem to be really smart, and by the way, I think you are, but I haven't got it all sorted out.
Yeah, I think there's a lot to that, David. I'll tell you my experience when I do a lot of lecturing. This just happened yesterday. And I love to open it up for questions, but very, very often I can instantly tell that the person who's asking the question is working from a different paradigm or a different mental model or a different sort of intellectual map than I am. And this is one of the reasons I can't just give an answer, because if they're asking the question within a certain paradigm or universe, I can't actually answer the question to their satisfaction without entering into their universe. And if part of what I'm trying to do is get people to consider moving into a different universe, then I don't want to answer the question in their box, so to speak. But I want to respond to it in a way that maybe will help them imagine a little window in their box or a little door in their box and see that there's a bigger world outside. And of course, it goes all different ways, but I used to resent that. I can think back to several pivotal moments in my own intellectual and spiritual and moral development when I encountered someone who was outside my box.
Right.
And it frustrated me. My first thought is to say they're wrong. But what I started, on some intuitive level, I could tell, it's not that they're giving the wrong answer to my question. It's that they're asking a different question entirely, and I don't even get what that is,
Well, it's so much about, it seems to me, about presupposition and worldview and like you said, model, map, and paradigm.
Yeah.
Do you find, are you hopeful as you continue to write and think and speak? Do you see those windows appearing a little bit more than maybe you used to 10 or 15 years ago?
Well, I'll tell you something I've experienced very directly that gives me a lot of hope. Two things. One is that when you're in a community, and this is very true in religious communities, but I think it would be true in a scientific discipline, there are just certain questions that can't be asked or certain approaches that can't be taken, certain projects that are not fundable. In the early stages, when somebody raises new questions that are outside the box, they often are punished in various ways. But if just a few people are willing to stand up to the punishment and respond graciously, but without deferring and complying, so sort of this mixture of courage and grace, when that happens, other people suddenly are liberated. They can then ask those questions, and that really does open up space. So that's the first thing I'd say, is that there really is, when people are given a portal into a more spacious place, I think many, many of them want to take it. But the second thing is that we're all living, of course, you as a philosopher know there's an awful lot of philosophical baggage to unpack here, but we're living in the same external reality that has ways of impinging upon all of our little systems. And so, the fact that we've all got to deal with global climate change, whether we believe in it or not right now, the fact that we've got to live in a world with weapons of mass destruction, the fact that we are grappling with economic systems that are rigged to favor the super elite, those realities affect all of us and in some ways force us to, we have to communicate. We can't afford to just keep retreating into our little ghettos, because those realities, the sea level will get us all very wet.
What do you think about? I love your notion of a mixture of courage and grace, and I think from what I know about you and the reading of your work that I've done over the years is you really are trying to shift the conversation. So here we got a pastor who went through a huge shift, and a teacher and a lecturer and so on, trying to kind of almost recenter the conversation and reframe the questions that are being asked. That's sort of the preamble to how do you have a new conversation about religion? How do you have a new conversation about Christianity or about, notions of courage and grace when we're still, it seems, dealing with what you would have probably called maybe in your latest book, the Christopher Columbus approach.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
In fact, you know what, Brian? I'm going to do it. I wasn't going to read it, but I am, and I've got it open up right here. Quote, in seeking to strike a healthy and honest balance in telling our history, I'm convinced, that's Brian, by the way, for our listeners, that we Christians, Western Christians in particular, must acknowledge the degree which our faith has become a syncretized faith, compromised faith. We might even say a corrupted faith. From Constantine to Columbus to the other conquistadors to the colonizers to the present, we have mixed authentically Christian elements of love, joy, peace, and reconciliation with strictly imperial elements of superiority, conquest, domination, and hostility, close quote. I was trying to think of something funny to say there, Brian, and I couldn't think of it because that's a pretty serious little passage you got there. And so here we are, so we've got all this all this baggage, all this nonsense for the past, so many years that cultures around the world are dealing with, not only from a Christian perspective, but a religious perspective as well. And so when you or I or anyone else says, well, hang on a second here, the God that you're talking about over there on that side, Mr. Dawkins, or, if we want to take an extreme example, a Richard Dawkins or a Sam Harris or somebody like that, yeah, you know what? I don't believe in that either. How do you find that, and I want to get a little bit more to your book about, by the way, the book I just read from is Brian's last book, or maybe second last book, Why Did Jesus, Moses, the Buddha, and Mohammed Cross the Road? Highly recommend it. And you can get it, I believe, online through Jericho Books, probably at Amazon as well. Sure. Yeah, so Brian, there's probably 15 questions in there, and I apologize for that. Yeah. But I think, to go back to your idea of map, and framework and so on, if we're not on the same page, what the heck are we going to do?
Yeah. Well, a couple things about that. Obviously, this is one of the most important questions we could ever talk about, David, and it's one that I care about a whole lot.
Indeed, yep.
But the first thing I would say is we should first recognize that this is not just a problem in Christianity. Since I wrote that book, Why Did Jesus, Moses, Buddha, Muhammad Cross the Road, I've been contacted by so many people of different religions who've said, hey, nice to see you Christians dealing with your issues. We've got our issues too. And so there are parallel conversations happening in Islam and in Judaism and its many forms. And it's even interesting to hear, Buddhists are having some big struggles in different parts of the world, realizing that, trying to figure out what's the essence of Buddhism and what is less and less helpful as we move forward. So this is a global problem that has to do with and a global challenge and opportunity that has to do with a rapidly changing world. It doesn't matter if you're Buddhist or Muslim or Hindu or Jewish. You suddenly find yourself living in a world of general relativity, quantum theory. It's a world of an expanding universe of billions of galaxies, 14.7 billion years old. Everybody is trying to come to terms with living in the same universe, even though we have these very different languages and what some philosophers call imaginaries, meaning a system of images in which we live. And that's one of the reasons why discussions about God are so both significant and maddening. We aren't just talking about some invisible friend or invisible king living somewhere. When we're talking about God, we're rendering a universe. Our discussions about God are always discussions about the universe, creation, what's real, what matters. And that's why they're so fraught and so conflicted, and yet so inescapable and important. So, to me, it can be disconcerting, but in another way, it's absolutely predictable. I love what there's a Catholic thinker who died some years ago named Vincent Donovan, and Vincent said, in times of rapid change, you can be sure that religious people will be among those most passionately clinging to their institutions and the past. He said, but there will also be among religious people sort of the visionaries and the mystics and the deeper thinkers who are those who are most open to receiving, the new opportunities that present themselves. And so that to me is what's so exciting about it. And it is difficult, but this is where you need a few people who have a whole lot of courage at the beginning. I mean, 500 years ago, they would have been thrown in jail, banished, maybe even tortured and killed. Now they might just have a bunch of nasty blog posts written about them, so we can't really complain. But a few people at the beginning, it takes a lot of courage. But then more and more people come on board, and it takes less and less courage. That doesn't mean the work is over. But then the focus can be less on fighting with the gatekeepers of the status quo, and the focus can be on the creative work of saying, okay, how are we going to talk about meaning and purpose and the ultimate realities and morality and the ethical summons that life presents to us.
Do you think that it could be helpful to talk more about a God hypothesis, or could it be helpful to talk about a creator versus just this idea of God, whether you're a Muslim or a Jew or a Buddhist? Buddhists don't, I suppose, believe in any kind of traditional God in that sense, but just because of the baggage, because of folks, it's seemingly inability to get beyond what used to be. I think, I don't know if you and I have had this conversation in the past, but a few years ago, Philip Pullman's stuff, the Golden Compass and so on, that came out, and the Catholics got all upset about it, and lots of, I'm sure, conservative Christians and people were picketing and so on. And I remember getting into a conversation with somebody, and I read the books, and this main character wants to kill the authority, and the authority is God, and so isn't this horrible, and we've got to picket this. And I read the books, and I remember saying to Elizabeth, I'd kill the God too.
Yeah.
I'd be the one conspiring against this being. So if that's the state of affairs we're in, then do we need to come up with some new language, Brian? Like, I'm actually thinking of writing an essay called "Why I Am No Longer a Christian," and I've started making, because I don't want to be you don't need to push me out of the boat, guys. I'm jumping out.
Yeah. Well, here's I obviously I don't think there's a single right answer to that. For over 100 years, people have been grappling with this, and you read some writers who they don't want to use the word God because that evokes an old man with a white beard who throws thunderbolts. I mean, it's a lot more like Thor or Zeus, but somehow it's still deeply embedded in Christian thought. And so they would use words like the divine, or Paul Tillich came up with an interesting term, the ground of being. He didn't want to talk about a supreme being. He wanted to say that whatever God is, God can't be just one being alongside all the others. God must be being itself. And so there have been a lot of attempts to talk about, to find language to jar God out of the of some of these problematic images. But here's the problem, I think, David, is when you start using a different language, then the people who still use that language have no idea. They don't talk to you anymore because you're not really talking to them anymore. And so I'm not criticizing people who take that route, but there's a cost to taking that route. So what I think we need is, in academics, we call it meta-discourse. It's saying we're not just going to talk about the government, we're going to talk about how we talk about the government. We're not just going to talk about social media, we're going to talk about how we talk about social media. So that means we're not just going to talk about God, we're going to talk about how we talk about God. We're going to take a step back. And that to me is a very, very exciting and important discussion. Rob Bell wrote a book about this recently. What is it? What we speak of when we speak of God.
Right.
Another friend of mine, Peter Rollins, wrote a book some years ago called How Not to Speak of God. A great philosopher who does a lot of work in this is Richard Carney. A couple of years ago, I read a really interesting article by a guy named Michael Epstein, and he was talking about theism in post-Soviet Russia, and he said, before the Soviets, you had Russian Orthodoxy, then you had official state-sanctioned atheism. And when the state no longer sanctions atheism, he said, will people go back to the old Eastern Orthodoxy? Do they welcome in New Age or Jehovah's Witnesses or whatever? And he wrote very interestingly about this struggle to find a new way of talking about God after atheism. And one of his reflections was to say, in the past, we always talked about God as the one who speaks and reveals and gives laws and so on. He said, I wonder in today's world if we don't need to speak about God as the one who listens, as the witness to what happens. Well, suddenly, just opening that idea up is, I remember reading that and I just felt like a little hole got punched in my roof and a little more light came.
Right.
So.
Very nice. Yeah. Do you find, that's I love that image. Diane Ackerman, I think, in A Natural History of the Senses, talks about, the purpose of art being to shine light in the darkness.
Yeah.
Do you think that that's kind of where you're at today with some of these bigger questions, these darker threads, as you've called them in history? If you can shine a little light, if you can peel back a little bit, you're not going to turn it all upside down overnight. We won't know if we're in the middle of a reformation for another couple hundred years, probably.
Yeah, that's right.
Right.
That's
so
right.
Is that would you say that's where you're at today?
Well, I think all of us who care about these things, we do everything we can, and we, I think, all have a whole lot of passion. I mean, we don't want to go running down the street with sandwich boards and repent signs. But,
that's right.
but we feel a little bit like that sometimes. We feel like, if you want an apocalyptic reality, just look at what's going on in our world today. But we also want to be purveyors of hope and inspiration and open up those little places where some light can stream in. But what is so absolutely encouraging about all this is you start doing it, and then people start showing up and saying, I've been thinking about the same thing.
Right.
I was asked to lecture a couple of months ago at something called the Center for Muslim Christian Understanding. And it was a really great day of it was just lectures from morning to night, and a couple of them were a little long, but most of them were just so fascinating. And it turned out that when I had to go to the airport to go home afterwards, a Muslim, a fellow from South Africa, happened to be in the airport, and I had thought his lecture was just brilliant. And the two of us sat in the airport. We almost were like ready to just miss our planes because the chance to talk. And we were talking about God. We were talking about what we mean when we say the word God. And he was talking about the struggles with that in Islam. I was talking about the struggles with it in Christianity. And what to me is kind of exciting is wouldn't it be interesting if these struggles in meta-discourse, these struggles that they aren't just challenging what we believe, they're challenging our whole set of images that frame how we believe. It's challenging the tools by which we believe, if I can say it that way.
Right.
Wouldn't it be interesting if that forced us into this larger conversation? And this is why, if you want to say you're no longer a Christian, that's fine. But this is one of the reasons I continue to identify myself as a Christian, is because I think there are incredible treasures in the Christian tradition. Mm-hmm. There's all kinds of bozos doing all kinds of pathetic and ridiculous and counterproductive things. But guess what? There are some atheist bozos, and there's bozos everywhere.
That's right.
Yeah. But there are really great treasures in the Christian tradition, and I want to be among many who try to find those traditions, cherish them, and then bring them as gifts to other people. And then I want my Muslim neighbors to be doing the same. I want them to find the treasures, because we all know there's a lot of nutcases in the Islamic world, but we want the Muslims who we can trust to find those treasures. And I want to hear them, and it's something I love about my Buddhist friends, all the way back to when I was in high school and back in the 60s and early 70s when a lot of people were exploring Buddhism. The great thing about my Buddhist friends is they'd always like to tell me the latest nugget of insight they got in Buddhism, but they never were trying to make me be a Buddhist. They were willing to share their Buddhist treasures with me, whether or not I was a Buddhist. And that's the spirit I hope we can have. We find our treasures and we bring them to each other, because I think we need all the help we can get.
I think the title of your next book should be "Why I Don't Wear a Sandwich Board."
Okay.
Can you write that down, Brian, for me?
I like it.
I can see the design work already, I think.
I can too.
On the front of the cover. So let's ask a bigger question. Why God? For you? I mean, obviously it's a part of your upbringing, and you're a pastor and a huge tradition and so on. But the atheist on the other side of this conversation says, "Yeah, but why do you need any of that, Brian? I mean, it's why didn't you and the Muslim, the guy from South Africa, why didn't you talk about something else? Why didn't you just talk about this celebratory notion of love and embrace and community? Why do you need to ruin everything and throw God into it?"
Yeah. Well, I mean, David, you can ask that question very simply, but as you know, it's a whole lot of people are grappling with that. A good friend of mine who's a well-known Christian leader, we were together a couple months ago. He says, I've pretty much just thrown out the whole idea of God now. I'm done with it.
Wow. And this is a guy who grew up in the tradition and...
Yeah, I won't mention his name out of respect for him, but what was interesting is, and of course I understand that, because often people in the religious world see so much hypocrisy and so much craziness. They see how money really pulls way more strings than love does very often, and pride and greed and all the rest. But he was saying, I'm just tired of fighting about that word. But what was interesting is he wasn't saying, so I think life is just a meaningless pile of crap and we're just a bunch of fermenting little cellular material that's eventually going to decompose and the whole thing will blow up when the sun goes supernova, and it doesn't really matter at all, So, in fact, what he was saying is, I think there is a stream of purpose and direction and meaning and goodness that is very, very intrinsic in the universe. And I think all this talk of God distracts us from it. And I just want to focus on that essence without all the distraction. Well, here's and of course he knew what I was going to say. I was going to say, but I think that's what God really is. That pearl of great price that you found, that precious thing that you don't want to be distracted from. The irony is, I think that's what God really is. And here's what's sort of strange. When you think about the ancient Hebrew passion against idols, we don't want to put God into rock. We don't want to ever make an image of God. We don't even want to write the name of God down. And in fact, in some Jewish and other religious traditions, we don't even want to say the G word.
Right.
We'll talk about, the creator, the one, the whatever, the divine. But that resistance to ever letting God be concretized too much, I think, is an attempt to acknowledge that God is always, whatever God is never contained in our box. If you think about religion and theology as the construction of boxes to contain God, there is a point you get to in the religious world, and they often call these people mystics or contemplatives, but it's when people say, I love my tradition because it gave me all of these boxes that I know God is outside of.
Wow, cool.
And they love the tradition because it disciplined them to focus their attention in the direction of this great mysterious reality. In the Christian tradition, as you know, we talk about this in terms of two very technical words, but they're kind of nice words to know. There's the cataphatic tradition and the apophatic tradition. And the cataphatic tradition is the one that said we can talk about God, we can have doctrines about God, we can have images for God, we can discuss God, we can even try to define God maybe. But then the apophatic tradition comes along and says, are you crazy? God is always bigger and greater and deeper, and our minds are so tiny and our language is so limited. And that dynamic tension between those two, it seems to me, is what keeps us going. And that's what I'd like to, I hope I can live in that both and tension.
Don't you think, though, Brian, I mean, I love all of what you just said, but don't you think we, and I was going to say the West, and I'm not going to say that. I'm going to say human beings. I mean, part of the liability of being human is the box, it seems to me, is the mathematical equation. I mean, I bring this up, I've brought this up many times in past conversations. It's an old film, not a great film, called The Prophecy with Christopher Walken, and he plays, I believe, Angel Gabriel, and he's sitting on the steps smoking a cigarette, and there's a bunch of kids around him, and he's got to leave in a hurry, and I think he's been chatting with these kids, and in a Christopher Walken kind of way says, study your mathematics, kids, it's the key to the universe. And off he goes. And I've never forgotten that. I've forgotten the movie, but I've never forgotten that scene. And I think that's, I mean, I'm sorry, but I think Chris and I think the Angel Gabriel in this case were wrong. I don't, and in a way, it seems that's kind of what we're fighting against. We love the narrative solution, isn't it? The movies that make the most money are the ones that resolve, and so on and so on and so on. And I see this in my kids. I see it in kindergarten. I see it at Cub Scouts and in music, and it just, the list goes on. And so, I don't like the phrase "that's how we're wired," but it almost seems like it in a way. It's, almost seems like it in a way. So,
Well, an analogy comes to mind. So I was a little kid and I took piano lessons and I learned how to do all the arpeggios and the scales and I learned the theory. And I played classical music in my recitals. And that was the box in a sense. And of course, there's great beauty in all of that. But then later I picked up the saxophone and I became hugely interested in jazz. And suddenly you realize that all of those rules that you learned in classical now make possible this thing called improvisation,
Right.
And then you find out there's this thing called rock and roll and all the rest. And so I think this is one of those both and things. You know what? Mathematics are really important, but it'd almost be fun to take that scene from that movie and then replay it in a few different ways. Like you could imagine the older guy saying, "Follow the wonder, kids. It's the key to the universe." Focus on love, kids. It's the key to the universe. And this to me is the audacious claim that the Christian faith at its best makes, that it's follow the love, kids. It's the key to the universe. It's not follow domination, kids. Follow compliance, kids. Follow keeping your head down and doing what you're told, kids. It's follow love, even if that means you have to stand up against the religious and political authorities of the day, even if it means you have to offer yourself and give up your life for love and peace and reconciliation and so on. Man, that's a pretty compelling message. Now, I think we have to acknowledge it might be untrue. In the end, it might be that's just a nice pipe dream, but the only thing that really matters is making sure your sperm gets connected to enough eggs that some kind of biological process continues. And it really doesn't, and that doesn't really matter in the end either, because it's all going to be incinerated in a supernova and no one will ever know that DNA ever existed. So, there are alternative ways of looking at the big picture, but this is what remains compelling to me in spite of all of the slime that you have to root through looking for a diamond sometimes.
It's like what is it, that 400 feet of shit pipe in Shawshank Redemption that
That's
that
right.
Tim Robbins has to crawl through, right, to get to the other end. And what I love about that scene, Brian, is he pops out at the end and he stands up and it's pouring rain. It's not, it's not a beautiful sunny day. Yeah,
Yeah.
you just piled out of that pipe, and you're in the middle of a storm. We believe it or not, we've got to kind of wrap up shortly, and I really do want to thank you again for all your time today. But here I'm going to just throw out a real simple question for you: is it are we all kind of looking towards the same God? So if we can agree that the best part of the box is that we can step outside of it, with the Buddhist and the Muslim and the Jew and the Hindu in the room and the Christian in the room, are we all ultimately kind of, in your mind, looking towards the same source of light?
Yeah. Well, it was interesting when I wrote this book, We Make the Road by Walking. I was really trying to get to the essence or the heart or that essential treasure, in Christian faith, and there were a couple of words that ended up becoming really important in the book, and one of them was the word aliveness. And I use that word because when you just say life, it doesn't catch it sometimes. I actually think that the term that's very important in the Gospels, eternal life, doesn't mean a length of life that continues after death. I think it means this deeper, fuller aliveness. It's called in the New Testament once abundant life, or life to the full, or overflowing life, that kind of a thing. I think that at our best, even at our worst, what we're looking for is aliveness. And aliveness is so precious that sometimes people become heroin addicts because they're seeking aliveness, and they find a really destructive way of seeking aliveness. Fundamentalist religion is a way of seeking aliveness, and it ends up hurting a lot of people in the pursuit. But the aliveness is the treasure. That's one word. Then the other word that I became intrigued with is the word at the beginning of the Gospel of John, which is the word logos. Mm-hmm. This idea that, isn't it a stunning statement? In the beginning was the Logos. And the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. Well, that's a pretty amazing thing to do with Logos. Now, I think what John is doing is taking that Greek term, and I don't think he's putting what he understands Jesus to be teaching into the box of the Greek Logos. I think he's throwing that Logos out. He's saying, there's a way better Logos. Right. There's a way better logic or pattern or arc or meaning or shape or grain to the universe. And that's what we're seeking. And I think in a real way that's what we're all seeking.
Wasn't the Logos the name of the ship in the Matrix?
I forgot about that. That might be true.
I think it is. Listen, I could spend another 2.5 hours with you on this topic without missing a beat, or even stopping for a pee break or another coffee.
I feel the same way. What could be better to talk about than this?
I know, it's fantastic. It really is great. So thanks so much, Brian. I got to say, Why Did Jesus, Moses, the Buddha, and Mohammed Cross the Road was a delightful read. I've read lots of your stuff and continue to enjoy it. I hope some of our listeners will do the same. Brian McLaren, that's brianmclaren.net, by the way. Check out his site. He's got a terrific blog, lots of links and wonderful things going on. And of course, his new book, We Make the Road by Walking. My line, I keep saying this on most of my podcasts, and one of these days I'm just going to come up with it, Brian, but I'm trying to find a way to end my podcast, kind of like, what's his name used to say, with good night and good luck, and my line is going to be something like, boy, there's more going on here than meets the eye, and something along those lines, because I feel like, we've barely scratched the surface. So Brian McLaren joining us today, brianmclaren.net. Make sure you check out his site, his new book, We Make the Road by Walking. And also, Why Did Jesus, Moses, the Buddha, and Mohammed Cross the Road? A delightful, terrific read that you really need to access. Thanks again for joining us today, Brian. We just, barely scratching the surface, so hopefully we'll be able to get to do this again one day soon.
Thanks. I look forward to it.
Thanks, Brian.